How do? Welcome back to my world of stuff. It's the 29th of December today, and it was brought to my attention variously over the last couple of days that yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the debut of the Fourth Doctor, Mr. Tom Baker, on TV in Doctor Who. Incredibly, 50 years. And I thought I needed to do something to mark a very particular occasion, so I thought I would do a little video celebrating the Fourth Doctor and celebrating what are, in my view, his 5 finest television serials across his very long 7-year run in Doctor Who. So, let's do it. Yes, all right, I know it's not the Fourth Doctor Sonic. I haven't got one of them, all right? Let's get on with it. Yes, 50 years of Tom Baker. I'll get rid of this. 50 years of Tom Baker as Doctor Who, or 50 years since he made his debut as Doctor Who. And this video at least gives me a chance to wear my Tom Baker scarf, which is always a pleasure. Yeah, it's amazing to think that it was 50 years since Tom Baker made his incredible debut in Doctor Who. It was a risky proposition, really, changing the Doctor after 5 years of John Pertwee, who'd taken the show to new heights of success after effectively saving the show at the end of the 60s when it looked like it might be headed down the dumper. His urbane, lavish, extravagant portrayal of the Doctor saved the show. But when he left in 1974, it was a difficult time because how do you replace somebody who's been so incredibly popular? Ultimately, you replace him with somebody who's even more popular. But Tom Baker, with the scarf and the hat and the slightly bohemian look that he had, his ramshackle collection of clothes and his obsession with jelly babies and his very alien appearance, made him a real hit with students at the time. And of course, this is pretty much where Doctor Who organised fandom began in Tom Baker's time, for better or for worse. But I remember Tom starting in 1974. Of course, it was a difficult time because I was a massive fan of John Pertwee. And looking back now, as I've said before, he remains my favourite classic Doctor because I think across the 5 years of his time, his performance never faltered and the production generally didn't falter. It was foursquare and solid throughout those 5 years, whereas I think that Tom drifted a bit as he went on. But Tom sort of connected almost immediately. And I remember very clearly, because I'm that old, watching that first episode, that slightly chilly post-Christmas evening in 1974, apprehensive about the change, but taking to him almost immediately, especially by the time Robot had finished, which was very much a story, a hangover from the Pertwee era with Unit and Bessie and that whole comfortable, familiar feel, which was a very clever thing to do because it reminded the audience that this was the same Doctor Who, that this was the same man, the same people were around him for now. But of course, that was to change as Unit was slowly phased out of the series over the next year or so. But I think it was a good start. The ratings were huge, they got even bigger as the series went on, and Tom made the role his own very quickly. I said this before and I'll say it again, however, I think that Tom, his Imperial phase is in his first 3 seasons. Those are the seasons produced by Philip Hinchcliffe, who along with his script editor Robert Holmes had a very clear vision about what they wanted to do with Doctor Who, taking it out of the nursery and making it much more family friendly and even perhaps a slightly older audience. And for 3 years they rattled along with a really mature and sophisticated reinvention of Doctor Who that kept one foot in the past, but it was very much aimed at a more mature teenage and above audience because the stories got cleverer and more sophisticated. And that was all held together by Tom's incredible performance in those first 3 years when he was this rather cold, distant, aloof alien. You very much felt he was an alien who consorted with humans because he quite liked humans, but he didn't have much patience for them, didn't have much patience for authority, and you always felt in those first 3 years that he was thinking about things. And Tom has said this himself, and I've said this before as well, I think, talking about Tom. You felt that there was something going on behind his eyes, and he's thinking about things that we couldn't begin to understand or comprehend. And that came across really well in Tom's first 3 seasons. After that, of course, things changed. A new producer came in, Graham Williams, because the BBC had so many complaints about violence in Doctor Who. And the show was toned down a little bit. And with Graham Williams as a slightly softer producer, Tom's tendency towards comedy and parody stepped up. So I think his performance slipped after his 3rd season. There were some good turns here and there, as we will see in this list. But I think that coupled with financial problems at the BBC, I think there was various recessions and God knows what else going on. The budgets weren't stretching as far as they used to in later seasons, and the show became a little bit more threadbare. And this was, again, unfortunate because Star Wars was out there by now in the late 70s, and Doctor Who was not looking good in comparison, shall we say. And I think I've always said this I think is where Doctor Who's decline really began, when Star Wars arrived and people started looking at Doctor Who and thinking, I like this, but it's a bit tatty. And that's how the show sort of progressed into the 80s. But Tom, in those first 3 years, is just absolutely magnetic. He dominates the show when he walks into a scene. All eyes are fixed on him. And he, across that time, had some classic stories, classic serials, 4-part serials, 6-part serials, which are rightly regarded as classics within the Doctor Who canon. 2 of those are Genesis of the Daleks and Pyramids of Mars from the 12th and 13th season. They're not on my list. Not because I don't like them, I think they're great stories, but to be honest, I've seen them so much. They're ones which tend to get repeated quite a lot. They seem to be ones that people revisit a lot. And I've never loved them the way that some people do. I really like them. I think Genesis is terrific. It introduces Davros, who becomes one of the iconic Doctor Who characters. And I appreciate the atmosphere of Pyramids of Mars. My connections to them are linked back to how I felt at the time. And I was still missing Unit, to be honest. I was still missing Unit's 5-man army. Doctor Who was changing, and I hadn't quite got used to that. So I'm conscious that those are 2 great stories, highly and rightly acclaimed, but they don't figure in my top 5. Speaking of which then, let's get on with my top 5 Tom Baker Doctor Who stories. Number 5 is the final story from Tom's 3rd season and the show's 14th season, and it is the serial that brings to an end the Philip Hinchcliffe era of Doctor Who. It's the Talons of Weng-Chiang, which was broadcast from February 1977 for 6 weeks. This is the story of the Doctor and his relatively new companion Leela, arriving in Victorian London in a sort of a Jack the Ripper, Sherlock Holmes type scenario, beautifully evoked by a superb script from Robert Holmes, who is in his element here, with some dirty doings in the sewers of London. Something strange is going on. Girls are being kidnapped, their life force is being sapped, giant rats are rampaging through the sewers. And it all ties together with the Doctor and Leela teaming up with an unlikely double act of Jago and Lightfoot, a music hall proprietor and a police forensic officer, as it were. And it's just a beautifully staged story. The BBC always did and do these sort of Victorian things with such class, that the location filming in parts of London which I know and recognisable, full of mist and fog and hooting horns of ships on the Thames, assassins creeping through the streets, music halls. It's just such a beautifully put together story. It comes under a lot of criticism these days because of its representation of Asian characters, particularly the lead sort of villain Lee Sen Chang, who's played by the extremely British actor John Bennett in yellow face makeup. And I know that a lot of viewers now can't tolerate this story because of that. They can't see beyond that. And I know there has been a massive sort of backlash against the story over the last few years. I put it in the perspective of this is what they did at the time. Doesn't necessarily excuse it, but I think you have to say, well, this, in the 70s, that was de rigueur for television. It's what they did. And it doesn't, for me, lessen the power of a fantastically exciting story, which is very cleverly crafted as a 4-part story with a 2-part story tagged on at the end, which is in the same part of the same story, but feels like it's a change of pace from what we'd had before. So ignore the critics if you can. Watch this as a fantastic example of Doctor Who mixing science fiction and history with a scintillating performance from Tom Baker, who just strides through this, having a whale of a time. Number 4. Number 4 is The Robots of Death. I think I've done a retro review on this back in the mists of time. And this is a story which makes my list because of sort of personal reasons in a way, as I think I've probably mentioned in the past again. This is a story that introduced me to Doctor Who fandom, the realisation there were actually other people out there who were fans of Doctor Who and wrote about it and talked about it and made fanzines. And this is my doorway into what became a sort of a career in writing, if you like. Although I'm not a qualified journalist, I have written as a journalist for many years, and it was Doctor Who fandom that got me into that, and it's Robots of Death that got me into Doctor Who fandom. Watching that very first episode which aired in January 1977, with the TARDIS spinning through space, landing on a sand miner where these elegant rock robots wandering around and these humans in these incredible Art Deco costumes. The whole look of the thing. I just remember watching this and thinking, wow, this is what Doctor Who is. This is a real science fiction space thing. It just affected me in a major way and made me seek out the world of Doctor Who fandom, other people who were talking about the show and interested in it. I still think it's a great serial even now. I think the last episode does drift into megalomaniac on the loose sort of thing, but I think it's very atmospherically done. Again, it's a great performance from Tom Baker, sparking off very well with Louise Jameson, which is interesting because they weren't really getting on at the time because Tom wasn't really happy with the character of Leela and didn't really want her on board. But it's a great production even now. It looks great, and it has that particular resonance to me because of what it led me into. Robots of Death number 4. Having said that Tom Baker's best performances were in his early years, we're going to go into his 6th season as the Doctor. We're going to go to 1979 and City of Death, which began on the 29th of September 1979. This is a marvellous story, and I think that this is a story that I would recommend that Stephen Moffat studies very, very carefully if he's writing future Doctor Who stories, because this is how you do humour in Doctor Who. This is how you do wit in Doctor Who. Stephen Moffat always speaks about jokes. Oh, yeah, jokes come easily. I can write Doctor Who stories full of jokes. Yeah. Doctor Who isn't a comedy. City of Death has that perfect balance of drama, science fiction, and humour and wit. There are no jokes in it, but there are witty things that people say. The witty ways people talk, the witty way that the Doctor behaves, particularly at this point, where Tom Baker is a little more loose in his portrayal of the Doctor, a little more out there. It's a fantastic story that was written fairly quickly, I think, by Douglas Adams under the pen name of David Agnew. Originally it was called The Gamble with Time, and it was going to involve casinos in Paris, but that didn't quite work out. Douglas Adams, who was the script editor at the time, from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, of course, he had to come up with something in a hurry, and I think he and Graham Williams came up with this story about the Mona Lisa. And it's a beautifully put together story. It's the first time the show had filmed on location, and we see that particularly in episode 1. There's lots of long shots of the Doctor and his companion, played by Lala Ward, wandering around the streets of Paris. Very much guerrilla style, because this is, tiny budget, minuscule crew going over to Paris and just grabbing the footage that they could. But it looks great because Doctor Who had never done this before. It really made it look more expensive. It made the show feel a bit bigger, and the show's world feel a bit bigger. And it's a really good story. It is witty, and that's the key word. It's witty. People say amusing things. The Doctor says amusing things. Romana says amusing things. But they're not cracking jokes all the time. It's not at the expense of plot. They serve the plot. But City of Death is just beautifully done. It's really nicely made. It's a great performance for one of my favourite British character actors, Julian Glover as Count Scarleone, the villain of the piece. Nice guest performance from Catherine Schell as his wife, who doesn't realise he's an alien with a spaghetti head, despite the fact she's been married to him for many years. And also the late David Graham, a doyen of Jerry Anderson's productions in the 60s, who appears as Professor Kerensky, who's working on some time experiments for the Count in the basement of his lair in the middle of Paris. It's a very clever story, very well put together, and it just looks great. Probably Tom Baker's last really compelling, enthusiastic performance. My number 2 is another classic from later period. This is the first story of season 15, and it's the first story with Graham Williams' name as producer, but it is very much an overhang from the previous regime. It's The Horror of Fang Rock, which began airing on the 3rd of September 1977. 4-part serial by the master of Doctor Who, Terrance Dicks. So evocative, such a simple idea, but it works so well. We're in 1911, a lighthouse off the south of England, Fang Rock. I mean, if that's not creepy enough in itself. As the story begins, we see a light dropping out of the sky and into the water. There's something wrong with the energy generator in the lighthouse. We meet the little cast of keepers of the lighthouse. The Doctor and Leela arrive. They are drawn to the lighthouse. A schooner crashes onto the rocks. The survivors of the schooner come into the lighthouse, but something horrible and green, because all monsters are green, stalking the lighthouse and killing everybody off one by one. really nice classic base under siege type story with people trapped in an environment, unable to get out, something horrible's trying to get at them. It's a great performance by Tom Baker. Again, he's got that alien feel that he had in the previous 3 series. He's walking around barking orders and being contemptuous to the characters around him who can't keep up. It is his last performance of this type, because as soon as the next story, Invisible Enemy, which is a space opera romp which introduces K9, he starts to go off the rails a little bit, and he's starting to get a little bit more eccentric at the expense of the mystery of the character. So Horror of Fang is just a great story which I can watch anytime. It's a really good script, great characters, really good dialogue, and it's got this real claustrophobic sense of menace. And the Rutan, the alien itself, is this green tentacled blob, which I think looks better in the original version than in the version that was CGI'd up for the recent Blu-ray box sets, where it just looks like a CGI blob. In the original, it's this thing covered in sort of wispy strands. It looks alien. And when Doctor Who does proper alien, it does it really well. Horror of Fang Rock, fantastic story. My favourite story, this will come as no surprise to anybody who watches this channel because I did a whole video on it not so long ago. It's The Seeds of Doom from January 1976. I mean, masterpiece of a story written by Robert Banks Stewart. Unfortunately, it's not available on the iPlayer now for various contractual reasons. The story and Terror of the Zygons, which Robert Banks Stewart also wrote early in the series, had to be removed from the iPlayer. I don't exactly know why, just contractual reasons. Hopefully they will return because they're both great stories. Seeds of Doom is particularly good. It's a familiar sort of story in that it riffs on The Thing from Another World, which was sort of something that season 13 did. It was riffing on classic horror and classic science fiction. And this was a riff on The Thing from Another World with these alien pods that are discovered in the Antarctic. One of them is destroyed in the Antarctic. The other makes its way back to England, where it falls into the hands of a slightly lunatic, obsessive plant collector named Harrison Chase, played by the late Tony Beckley. He wants to see this thing germinate to see what will happen, and it turns into this crinoid, which eventually becomes this massive, towering plant creature. It's another great script. It's another fantastic performance from Tom Baker. At his most vicious, in a way, he gets involved in fights. He's threatening people. He's jumping through glass windows and ceilings because he knows what will happen if the crinoid germinates and spreads its spores across the world. It's got a real pace and energy to it. It's got a maturity to it, and it's quite nasty in some places. All the stuff with Harrison Chase's threshing machine that he uses to pour compost into the soil. It's quite tough for a tea time children's family science fiction serial. It's just a great story, and so many highlights, so many little supporting characters, and so many moments. It is one of those stories, and in fact, I have to say, I think all of these stories I've selected do make you look wistfully back at classic Doctor Who and think, those are the days. I mean, modern Doctor Who has its moments, and I've been a fan of a lot of modern classic Doctor Who, but I just think that these stories are so well crafted and so detailed and have a nice pace to them. With Doctor Who now, it's all rush, rush, rush. Let's rush, let's get there, let's go on to the next thing, let's jump, let's leap about with bombastic, overpowering music. And these are just 5 great examples of really well cultivated Doctor Who stories that build and build, and they don't drag you along by the scruff of the neck. They just open themselves up and reveal themselves across 4 to 6 weeks, as Doctor Who always did. And I do miss that sort of storytelling in Doctor Who. Now it's so frantic. So those are my 5 favourite Tom Baker Doctor Who stories. I did think about doing some stinkers, but there's only a couple, to be honest, of stories which I would say are bad. And they're bad because the production lets them down. I think I mentioned this when I reviewed that recent Christmas clunker, that stories like Horns of Naimon and Underworld and Meglos from Tom's last season, they're intrinsically decent stories, but they're badly made. They're not served well by the visual effects and the whole production process. That brings them down. But I don't think they're necessarily bad stories in themselves. So I would say there are probably no really bad stories, no absolute howlers in this particular era of Doctor Who, in Tom Baker's era of Doctor Who, because you felt that everyone was really trying to make something that looked good and worked and stood up for itself. So those are my 5 best Tom Baker stories, and as I said, I didn't bother with any stinkers because I don't think it's particularly appropriate. But I would be very interested to hear if you agree with my list of stories. I'm sure many of you will put Genesis and Pyramids in, which is entirely understandable. They are great stories, and they are rightly regarded as Doctor Who classics. But these are 5 which I enjoy more than those 2. So I'd be interested to know what you think of my 5, and be interested to hear your 5, some of your favourite Doctor Who stories from the Tom Baker era, as we celebrate 50 years of the great man having become the Doctor. Incredible to think that it's half a century. And Tom is still with us, of course. He's 1991, and he's put out a couple of little Christmas messages on YouTube over the festive period, and hopefully he'll be with us for a few more years yet. He looks pretty hale and hearty, and it'll be a grim day, I think, when Tom leaves us. But for now, we won't think about that. We'll celebrate when he came to join us in the world of Doctor Who in December 1974. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you're new here, there's a good chance you might be. Why not like and subscribe? Press that button that says subscribe, and you'll be notified of upcoming videos. There's loads of Doctor Who on this channel. I'm halfway through another classic Doctor Who Revisited episode, which is coming up next week or so, I would think. And there's loads of film reviews, TV reviews, all sorts of bits and pieces. So you might as well come along for the ride, because it's free and it's fun. Right, thank you for watching. I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking that stuff.